The second chance, Noah and the Great Reset. All right, let's jump right into how our source frames the absolute beginning of the end.
The text plunges us right into a chilling reality with this quote. It started slowly, the way rot always does. The source describes this generational, almost completely unnoticed moral drift. The world didn't just collapse overnight. It drifted. Generation by generation, the moral compass just spun further and further from true north until the entire world had completely lost its way. It's a pretty stark reminder of how easily societies can slip when nobody's really paying attention.
Okay, let's dive into this. What did this slow moral drift actually look like? Well, according to the text, we're talking about a lie told here, a wrong ignored there. Kindness was just quietly replaced by cruelty and greed. Violence bled out into the streets, and children learned that survival simply meant domination, that strength meant taking, not giving. Idol worship and pleasure completely replaced any sense of purpose. And the text makes this incredible point that the constant, relentless noise of this civilization totally drowned out the truth. Humanity had been given these breathtaking gifts, and they essentially used them to build something fundamentally ugly.
Now let's see how this builds. The text presents a stark, undeniable contrast. On one side, we have the corrupted world. It's loud, totally focused on pleasure, full of relentless noise, and a completely normalized injustice. But on the other side, we have this anomaly, one man, Noah. He represents righteousness, purposeful action, and a quiet, deliberate consistency. He was literally one guy standing on solid ground in an absolute ocean of corruption.
And the text attributes this anomaly to one defining trait, integrity. The author defines it here as carrying a rare, unyielding commitment to righteousness in an era that has completely discarded goodness as worthless. The source is super clear that Noah didn't have a throne, an army, or some massive estate. By the world's standards, completely unremarkable. But he possessed this deep integrity, deliberately and quietly walking with God when the rest of the world collectively refused to listen.
Because of that global corruption, the text introduces the impending destruction. But the framing here is absolutely vital. The reset is not framed as cruelty, it's framed as consequence. The source neutrally, but very firmly establishes that the coming flood isn't an act of spontaneous damage or just simple discipline. No, it's an absolute, tragic consequence for a world that had rotted from the inside out and had blatantly refused all warnings. It was a complete and total reset.
So to survive this reset, Noah is given a very specific task. And God didn't leave this vague. Noah was handed a divine blueprint, requiring exact dimensions for the length, width, and height, specific materials to be used, and a precise number of decks. The author really highlights that this wasn't just a suggestion. It was a rigid, exact blueprint handed down by the Creator. And Noah? He followed it to the absolute letter.
But following that blueprint came at an immense social cost. I mean, you can imagine the absolute absurdity of a guy building a massive ocean liner-sized boat, basically in his driveway. The text details the extreme mockery that followed. Crowds literally gathered just to point and laugh at him. Noah was called delusional, a fool. Children actively mimicked his work, and respected men actually crossed the street just to avoid him. Yet between all the hammering, Noah desperately warned them every single day. He pleaded with his neighbors as he watched them walk right toward a cliff they simply refused to see. But no one listened.
But Noah kept building. Despite the brutal ridicule, despite the utter, wild absurdity of building a massive boat on completely dry land, he persisted.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core philosophical tension of the narrative. On one hand, we have the foundation of trusting human eyes, believing that a massive boat on dry land is completely absurd because, well, a flood of that scale had never been seen before. On the other hand, we have trusting God's word, building based on a divine command, knowing deeply that the truth doesn't actually need to be believed to be coming.
Next, the text describes what it frames as this truly unexplainable gathering. Animals arrived, guided by an ancient, wordless instinct older than language itself. Birds descended from the sky without any force. Creatures emerged from the forests, and predators walked side by side with their prey in this miraculous temporary peace. The wooden hall filled with the sound of hooves and wings. The text beautifully contrasts that eerie hope building inside the ark with the haunting reality of the world outside, just continuing on completely normally.
Then comes a moment of chilling finality. God closed the door. The text frames this single action as an act of simultaneous, absolute duality. It was profound mercy for the family inside, and absolute, inescapable judgment for those who had chosen, again and again, to stay outside. The door didn't slam, it simply closed with absolute finality.
Then the catastrophe begins. The text describes it starting with a single, completely unalarming drop of rain, but it intensifies by dawn into a relentless wall of water. The source details how underground reservoirs cracked open from beneath the earth with a deafening roar. Surging water swallowed valleys, roads, and homes from every possible direction at once. Panic hit. People fled to higher ground, screaming and scrambling for their lives as the low ground vanished in literally minutes.
Until, finally, the mountains disappeared. The source really highlights the shocking realization. Everything that people thought was permanent, solid, and eternal was actually temporary. The immovable ancient mountains were just snuffed out beneath the surface like candles.
40 days and nights. Just let that number sink in for a second. 40 days of relentless, hammering destruction. The sheer duration of the catastrophe is emphasized heavily here, while the ark, built perfectly to that divine blueprint, held perfectly together in the dark.
When the rain finally stopped, the silence was the first thing Noah noticed. The text captures the immense psychological weight of this sudden, shocking quiet. There was no wind, no distant screaming, just a world-sized, featureless ocean sitting exactly where an entire, bustling civilization used to be.
So, the crucial point is this stark reality. 8 people. 8 surviving individuals floating alone on the surface of an entirely erased world. 8 people holding the absolute entirety of human existence. As the water slowly receded, the text tracks this incredibly fragile timeline of hope. First, a raven was sent out, but found absolutely nowhere to land. Then a dove, which returned with nothing. But 7 agonizing days later, that same dove was sent out again, and this time it brought back a fresh, green olive leaf. Life was returning, and on the 3rd attempt, the dove didn't return at all. It had found a home. Methodically tracking these birds shows us how fragile hope slowly pushed up through the receding water.
Then comes the command to step into a clean world. The source describes Noah's profound experience of stepping out onto an uncorrupted, scrubbed clean earth. The air was entirely new, and what's his very first act? He builds an altar, not out of obligation, but out of a natural, overwhelming gratitude for being trusted with survival.
This leads us to a final covenant. God commands Noah's family to come out and makes a solemn, permanent promise to never destroy the earth with water again. The text uses some truly beautiful imagery here, describing the rainbow appearing as a divine signature written in light. It proved that judgment and mercy are not opposites. The author notes that God deliberately chose to hold back his immense power, offering this permanent reminder of restraint following a time of such great darkness.
Humanity had been handed a scrubbed clean earth, a second chance, which leaves us with the text's brilliant, lingering question, not just for them, but for us. When we are handed a second chance, what do we actually do with it?